what inspired you to take up this journey of genetics and genomics right after MBBS? Because really it's a path which is not that often traveled by students in the country, particularly a decade back. So if you can shed some light on the journey and what inspired you to take up this.
The journey was not really a chosen one, but rather by chance or accident. Um, all throughout medicine, I was really interested in research. Had a few opportunities to do some small projects with quite eminent faculty in the college. But it is just accident that uh, during one of the episodes, we landed up with one of the books. To be exact, the book was called Genes by Levin. And that really interested me because that gave a quite lucid understanding about what genetics and genomics is all about. And incidentally, that is also the time when the Human Genome Program got announced, the draft genome got announced. And it was very natural that anybody would think the next big frontier of medicine was genomics. And it is just by chance that I came upon an advertisement online for PhD positions, and this was from an institute which I belong to currently, the CSI Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology. They were starting a PhD program which involved multidisciplinary research and invited MBBS students. And I just took my chance and applied. And of course, after that, I plan to stay back, and then the story continues.
Very, very fascinating to know about that. But if you could shed a little light on the initial difficulties or challenges that you probably would have faced in taking up a field, being from the MBBS background, and how the initial few years were. And also, if you could end on the note of the, probably the moment of triumph, or how exactly you felt on sequencing the Indian human genome.
Well, so what I do is not really experimental science in many ways. I've always been interested in computer science, and that's how I ended up with genome informatics. So most of what I do in the lab is essentially sit in front of computers, build codes which can analyze the human genome, or for that matter, any genomes, and then make sense out of it. Now, the Indian human genome was also another chance which came along. We just happened to be sharing a lab with my colleague Dr. Sridhar in a non so discrete place in Delhi. This was an offshoot lab of the main campus. And then it just happened that we had the sequencers, we had the computers, and we got together and decided that we will sequence, probably try sequence the human genome. To be frank, there was no official program written on top of it. There was no official grant to it. It all happened just because the directors at that point of time were very appreciative of taking chances, and then it happened.
It's really fascinating to hear the story, sir. And you're really trying to downplay the achievement and remain modest of sequencing the entire Indian human genome. But to just take off from there, we know that the exposure to research and molecular biology is probably limited in the country, except barring some of the top institutes in the country like AIIMS, PGI, JIPMER, St. John's, CMC. But today, suppose there is an MBBS student who is inspired by you and wants to pursue a field in molecular biology and genomics. What advice would you give him to the path that he must take?
Yeah, I think the world is much more open than what we were way back. So I finished my MBBS in 2004. I finished my internship in 2004. Internet was just available. It was very expensive. It was very costly. But that's not true anymore. If anybody is interested in genomics, I think there is nothing preventing them from doing genomics, because at least for once, there is enough amount of data that is available in open repositories, freely available, and internet has been much more accessible, much more cheaper. Practically anything that you want to learn in genomics is available online. You don't need to be in a lab to learn genomics. You can actually learn it online off the internet today. So I think if anybody is interested in genomics, there is today nothing preventing them from doing genomics. Yes, for the experimental or the wet lab part of genomics, yes, you need to have some exposure. But I believe there are far more number of institutions and far more number of laboratories today than probably 15 or 20 years before, where you can now experience science, if not just genomics, general science and exposure to general experimental science is, of course, very useful for anybody who is interested in looking at research.
And perhaps just from knowing that there's a lot of trend of clinician scientists in the other countries, but perhaps time has come for a fundamental change in probably even our medical education system, where you have a molecular lab posting or bioinformatics or medical technology postings as part of the curriculum at the postgraduate level. You did mention before that you have, if you could just elaborate on what institutes like CSIR are doing for clinicians if they are interested in genetics, genomics, or molecular biology.
So there are multiple institutions under the CSI system which take in students with MBBS background for a PhD program. We do have at least a tenth of our faculty in the institute who have a medical background, and so I think I mean the environment is much more conducive. Any MBBS student who would want to come over and do a small project or want to spend time in the lab, there are many of them who have done that now in our labs, are always welcome to do that. Whenever you have a holidays of a week, a couple of weeks, feel free to come over and spend time in the lab.
I think that's a wonderful statement that you have made there for all the medical students and even postgraduates who are watching this, that, you know, if they want to spend time, I mean, they just get in touch with the relevant people and they're always welcome. I think that's very, very heartening to hear, sir. My last question for you in this segment is one really from a patient-centered point of view. That, you know, with so much progress in the field of molecular biology and genomics, and a lot of it happening in the research world, how does it translate to the benefit to the patient? So for example, from an oncology perspective from which I come, sometimes the tests such as NGS hereditary cancer panel or a lung cancer panel is really too expensive to be done. How do you think institutes like the CSIR and other top institutes can play a huge role in making these tests and molecular biology accessible to the patient community at large?
Okay, so now when we talk about genomics in clinics, I mean, there are three facets to it. The one facet is evidence. So you need to have appropriate evidence to warrant the use of a particular test in a particular clinical scenario. The second is accessibility to this test. That means that how are the patient going to access it? Are they going to send the samples to a lab in the US, or are they going to send the sample to a lab within the hospital? Do they have the expertise to do that and interpret it? And the third is, of course, affordability. And affordability essentially is a factor of scale in many ways, because if there are many doctors and many clinicians doing the same kind of test based on a very clear-cut sort of evidence, then in many ways it can be made affordable. Now, there are many ways we are trying to do this, and over the last decade or so, we have been trying to work with a large number of clinicians as part of many different programs to enable these three to come into unison. And I mean, all three of them are really important. One of the things that we have been working quite extensively have been in the area of rare genetic diseases, because in many cases, to put that number, almost 99% of the cases, there were never any molecular diagnosis done for conditions. And increasingly, rare disease space is one area in pharmaceuticals where there are a large number of new therapies which are made available. And many of these therapies actually require a molecular diagnosis to happen. So therefore, we anticipated that molecular diagnosis is going to be really important and a critical piece of evidence that will enable treatment for these conditions. Now, a lot of clinicians still think that many of these rare genetic diseases are not treatable, and they actually send back the patient saying that nothing can be done, which is actually really wrong, because quite a lot of things can be done. To just give an example, we have a quite large cohort of primary immunodeficiency disorders. Now, primary immunodeficiency disorders essentially means that patients do not have a functional immune system. For the severe varieties, the children die typically in the first 4 months of life. And in many cases, the doctors would not even recognize that they have immunodeficiency condition, because if you have ever gone to internship in pediatrics, the pediatric ICU is full of infections. I mean, and that's essentially what you treat. And so it is not just the problem of awareness, it's also the problem of looking into why does a child need to die at 4 months of age with a fulminant infection. There's no reason that should happen, right? So there are curious minds that need to come together and ask this question: why do these kids die? And then we, of course, created this quite large cohort at Calicut Medical College, which probably today is India's largest of its kind. We started looking at the genomics of these patients who die quite early, or the parents who have recurrent such deaths in their children, in the family. And when we find that many of these conditions are actually treatable, today we have a program where the high-risk individuals who have at least one child who have died out of fulminant infection could now be screened early on, and a definitive therapy can be administered. In some cases, this definitive therapy could be just immunoglobulins, IV immunoglobulins, or it could be hematopoietic stem cell transplants. And we have at least a couple of dozen of children now who are alive just because genomics is possible. And now we know what needs to be done. You can actually make it much cheaper, because the cost of doing genomics is not because it is really costly, but it is really because we don't really know what we need to look at. So if you know you're looking at a particular genetic disorder, the cost can really be cheaper, and cheaper in the sense of a couple of thousand of rupees, which typically is the cost of any other specialty test in clinical medicine, right? Or for that matter, a CT or an MRI, which is widely used in clinical medicine. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that you need a far more number of clinicians who are curious about problems. You need a far more number of clinicians who are interested in trying to solve a problem. And then, of course, there are solutions that can always be built, because evidence can be created and the test can be made cheaper.
I think that's a very, very interesting point that you make here, that in the future, probably, and I really hope that that future comes soon, ordering a genetic test and getting a result becomes as easy as CT and MRI. And I think that, like you rightly said, it needs a certain amount of curiosity from the clinician side to try to understand what is really happening. Thank you so much, sir. It's been really wonderful and so gracious of you to accept the invite, which was actually given at such a short notice to come on this Sunday afternoon. And it's been a delightful 1 hour. I will leave the final thoughts to you on really not only COVID, but the future of genomics in India. Your final concluding thoughts, sir.
Yeah, so like I said, we need to probably have a more cohesive way of looking at epidemics. So one of the programs that we have just recently launched, it is still in beta, we have not really gone live yet, has been a citizen science initiative aimed at looking at epidemics at much greater granularity. And this granularity is not just looking at the epidemic per se, but also a lot of other social factors around an epidemic. And one of the things that has come to a lot of people's notice during this epidemic is one about misinformation. And misinformation is probably much more lethal than the epidemic itself, right? You have people protesting against masks, there are people protesting against vaccines. You can see people protesting against everything. And this is essentially something that we need to really, really keep in mind, that misinformation is something that fast spreading probably much faster than the epidemic itself. So you need to understand epidemics in a more cohesive format, not just in understanding when and where did the epidemic occur or what is the quantum of the epidemic, but also to be able to put this into context and understand and see, can we tomorrow predict epidemics from happening? And if an epidemic occurs, how can we use the right set of tools to understand the spread of the epidemic and to contain it better, right? And this is something that needs to be put into place. And this open initiative essentially aims to at least start doing some parts of it, if not the entire part of it, at least some initial parts of it, right from looking at the data to be enabling predictions of epidemics in the future, looking at data to understand how an epidemic spreads, looking at data to build policies based on this evidence, to build better diagnostics, and of course, to look at the social spectrum around this. Like, for example, looking at how do you predict misinformation from data or from social media posts? How do you counter misinformation in a crowdsourced environment, so on and so forth. I think the link is out there. So I invite all interested people to actually have a look at it. And if you're interested and you have time to contribute, please to contribute.
I think that's very reassuring, sir. I think more than the pandemic, we are also battling what has been termed as an infodemic, with all the social media and the news channels and WhatsApp universities spreading fake news. And that is where we at Treat by Alter Doctors, during this time, we started off as a platform for doctors to express their passion, hobbies, reflection, and experiences. But we took a conscious decision that during the time of pandemic, we will stay a credible voice and try to bring in those aspects which are not covered by the mainstream media. You can visit us at www.alterdoctor.in and contribute any articles, or at facebook.com/treat4doctors. And this is very reassuring to see the citizen science approach for responding to academics. Dr. Vinod Skaria, thank you so much again for such an inspiring talk, and really you have been a path setter in more ways than one. Thank you so much for this enlightening talk on this Sunday afternoon. With that, this is me, Dr. Nitin Yashas, on behalf of Treat by Alter Doctors, signing out. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.